There's a saying inside the walls. Prison doesn't change a man, it reveals him. But what if that's not true? What if prison doesn't just reveal, it rewires? Deep inside some of the world's most secure facilities, where sunlight touches only concrete and silence becomes a language of its own, the human mind starts to do something extraordinary. It bends. It fractures. It adapts. Because the body can live without freedom, but the mind begins to hunt for meaning. And when it can't find it, it starts to create its own reality. In this film, we'll step into 4 prisons, for different worlds, each revealing a truth about what happens when the human brain is stripped of choice, contact, and control. From the steel cages of Colorado's Supermax, to the frozen tombs of Siberia, to the gang-run labyrinths of Sao Paulo, and the silent redemption of one man who refused to lose his soul. This is prison psychology explained. Because inside these walls, the question isn't what did they do, it's who do they become. Florence, Colorado. ADX Supermax, the most secure prison in the United States. The inmates call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Here, the lights never turn off. The doors never truly open. And the walls, they talk. Not with words, with silence. Each cell is a 7x12 concrete box. No windows, no sound, no color. Just a slit in the wall that lets in a fraction of daylight. Enough to remind you that the world still exists. Just not for you. One man, we'll call him Daniel, once described his first year here like being buried alive. He said, after the first month, you stop missing people. After the third, you stop missing touch. After the 6th, you stop missing yourself. Psychologists call it sensory deprivation. But inside, they call it the slow death. When the brain is denied stimulation, no sound, no color, no contact, it begins to feed on its own imagination. The walls begin to breathe. The shadows move. And the voice you hear next isn't always your own. For Daniel, it started small. The hum of the air vent began whispering his name. Then the tapping, rhythmic, calculated, always 3 knocks, then silence. He thought it was another inmate trying to communicate through the pipes. Until one day, the taps came from inside his cell. In psychology, this state is known as hallucinatory adaptation. The mind inventing sound and presence to replace what's missing. But for Daniel, it wasn't science. It was survival. He began talking to the walls. And over time, the walls started to answer. Because the human mind isn't built for isolation. It's built for feedback. Every glance, every word, every breath we exchange shapes who we are. Take that away, and the brain starts to collapse inward. It begins to cannibalize itself, turning loneliness into illusion. After 2 years, Daniel stopped responding to guards. He refused to eat, refused to move, and would stand for hours staring at the vent, waiting for it to whisper again. But here's the paradox of solitary. It breaks some men and builds others. Because in the same cells that crush the weak, some find a twisted form of peace, a silence so complete, it becomes a forge for transformation. There's a difference between being alone and being isolated. Alone is a choice. Isolation is a sentence. In Russia, deep in the Komi Republic, where the cold can freeze tears before they hit the ground, there stands a place known only by one name, White Swan. A prison built to bury men not in dirt, but in silence. Its walls are white. Its uniforms are white. Even the snow that covers the barbed wire glows white. It's a color that blinds the soul, until all that's left is the echo of your own thoughts. One of those men was Ivan Petrovich, a former soldier turned bank robber. He entered White Swan in 2004. He hasn't seen the horizon since. His world is a 9x9 concrete cube, a metal stool, and a Bible with missing pages. Guards speak only once a day to count the living. No conversation, no sound, just the scraping of boots and the endless whistle of Siberian wind. For the first month, Ivan screamed. He screamed at the walls, at the air, at God. He pounded his fists until the knuckles split. He wanted to feel something. But the silence always won. Psychologists call this the isolation effect. When sensory input drops so low that the mind turns inward, forcing it to fill the void. At first, hallucinations. Then detachment. Then a complete break from time. Ivan said later, I stopped counting days. Then I stopped knowing if it was day at all. The light never changed, so I thought maybe I was dead. The only way I knew I was alive was because it still hurt. In the absence of control, the brain begins to invent it. Ivan started pacing in perfect squares, 48 steps one way, 48 steps back. Every day, for years. It became a ritual, a religion, a lifeline. When they moved him to another cell, he didn't panic. He counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, until he reached 48. Then turned. Then walked back. He had rebuilt his reality from numbers. That was how he survived. This is what psychologists call cognitive re-anchoring, the brain's desperate attempt to impose order in chaos. But in prisons like White Swan, that order becomes obsession. And obsession becomes identity. Ivan stopped dreaming of escape. He stopped dreaming altogether. He told one guard years later, the worst thing they took wasn't freedom. It was the need for it. Silence had become his home. Solitary confinement rewires the brain's limbic system, the center of emotion and memory. When you remove human contact, it stops releasing the chemicals that make connection possible. Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. In their place, cortisol, adrenaline, fear. Your brain becomes addicted to stress. Because it's the only thing left that feels real. For some, like Ivan, isolation becomes identity. For others, it's a slow descent into madness. In 2011, guards found a man in the next cell writing his name over and over on the wall. Not with chalk, with blood. When they asked him why, he smiled and said, "So I don't disappear." Psychologists later described his case as self-anchoring behavior, a primitive instinct to prove existence when the mind doubts it. But in White Swan, he wasn't the only one. Because in isolation, you start to question not just the world, but yourself. You stop asking, "When will I get out?" and start asking, "If I did, would I even know how to live?" That's the real purpose of these places. Not punishment, not reform, but reduction, turning men into ghosts who forget what it means to be seen. And yet, even in that void, something strange happens. Some minds adapt, some even evolve. Ivan began meditating. Not the kind you read in books. A survival version, learned through desperation. He slowed his breathing until the cold no longer hurt. He imagined every exhale carrying away his fear, every inhale filling him with control. Over time, he claimed he could feel the guards' footsteps before they arrived, that he could sense which way the wind blew outside, without ever seeing it. Was it delusion or adaptation? Maybe both. Because when the mind is denied the world, it starts building one of its own. And that's the secret every prison psychologist knows. You can lock a man's body away, but you can never predict what his mind will become in the dark. If isolation kills the soul through silence, then chaos kills it through noise. Brazil, a land of music, color, and carnival. But just beyond the beaches and favelas, there's another world. A world where rhythm becomes riot, where order is not enforced by guards, but by gangs. Welcome to Carandiru Prison, once South America's largest penitentiary. Before it was torn down, more than 8,000 men lived inside walls built for half that. It wasn't just a prison. It was a city, a breathing, dangerous ecosystem, ruled not by the state, but by the strongest minds among the condemned. In Carandiru, psychology took on a new form, not the sterile kind from textbooks, but a primal, street-born evolution. There was no therapist here, but there was understanding. Because when every man has nothing to lose, every man learns to read human behavior like a weapon. They called it the code. If you looked a man in the eyes too long, it meant challenge. If you looked away too soon, it meant weakness. Every word, every gesture, every silence, a calculation. Prison psychologists later said inmates develop something close to empathic predation. A predator's empathy, not to connect, but to control. One inmate, known only as Felipe, described it like this. You learn people the way hunters learn tracks. How they breathe when they lie. How their voice changes when they're scared. That's your survival degree here. Inside these walls, you either understood the mind, or you became its victim. The gangs divided Carandiru by sectors. Each block ruled by its own hierarchy, its own justice system. Murderers, thieves, and drug lords became kings, while the guards patrolled outside, afraid to enter. The line between psychology and strategy blurred. Prisoners formed micro-societies, trade networks, security units, even education circles. They recreated civilization from the ruins of morality. Because here's the paradox. Even in anarchy, the human brain craves structure. Even in hell, it builds rules. In 1992, that fragile order exploded. A riot broke out, small at first. A dispute between rival groups. But within hours, Carandiru became a war zone. The guards called in the military police. They entered with rifles, tear gas, and orders to restore control. When it was over, 111 inmates were dead. Psychologists who studied the aftermath said something chilling. The surviving inmates didn't cry. They didn't rage. They reorganized. Within days, a new chain of command emerged. A new system of order. A new balance. That's the mind's ultimate paradox in captivity. When stripped of freedom, it doesn't seek peace. It seeks predictability. Because in chaos, predictability is the closest thing to control. Felipe explained it simply. If I know the rules, even bad ones, I can survive. What breaks you is when there are no rules at all. This is what psychologists call adaptive dominance. A mental framework where power becomes the new currency of safety. You dominate not because you enjoy it, but because it's the only way to stop yourself from disappearing. And yet, in these same halls of violence, another kind of psychology emerges. A guard once said, I've seen killers share their last meal with strangers. I've seen men risk their lives to protect someone weaker. It doesn't make sense until you realize it's all about identity. Identity, that's the key. Because prison doesn't just take your freedom. It takes your name, your purpose, your reflection. In a world built to erase individuality, some will reclaim it through power, others through kindness. But both are survival. After the Carandiru massacre, Brazil rebuilt its prison system, or tried to. But psychologists who visited the new facilities reported something fascinating. Even in new environments, the old social patterns returned. The same hierarchy, the same gang loyalties, the same invisible rules. Because the prison doesn't create the mind, it exposes it. One psychologist, Dr. Paulo Mendes, summarized it perfectly. You can't study human nature better than in prison. Out there, people wear masks. In here, they wear survival. And that's the dark truth. Every prison, no matter where it's built, is just a mirror. It reflects the society outside, the inequality, the fear, the hunger for control. The only difference is, in here, you can't look away. Next, we go north, to the frozen isolation cells of Norway's Halden Prison, where inmates live in comfort, not cages. A place so humane it feels unreal. And yet, behind the soft light and open doors, lurks another kind of psychological experiment. If Carandiru was the heart of chaos, then Halden is the illusion of peace. tucked deep in the Norwegian forest, surrounded not by razor wire, but by pine trees, stand what the world calls the most humane prison on earth. Halden Prison. No bars on the windows. No armed guards patrolling the halls. Every cell looks more like a college dorm than a cage. A bed, a desk, a TV, a private shower, and a view of the woods. Here, prisoners cook their own meals, record music, paint murals, and even work with psychologists daily. To outsiders, it looks like a resort. To critics, it's a mockery of justice. But to psychologists, Halden isn't softness. It's science. Because behind this experiment is a theory that punishment alone doesn't change behavior. Understanding does. Halden was built on a concept called restorative psychology. Instead of focusing on what the prisoner did, it focuses on what the prisoner can become. The idea is simple. If you treat people like animals, they behave like animals. If you treat them like humans, they start to remember they are one. But that theory comes with a question that divides even experts. Can empathy rebuild a conscience? A guard named Henrik explains. We don't carry guns. We don't shout. Our job isn't to control, it's to connect. The inmates see us every day, eat with us, talk with us. We build trust because that's how we build responsibility. In Halden, authority comes from respect, not fear. But respect has a cost. Because when you strip away the visible punishment, the bars, the chains, the uniforms, you leave the inmate face to face with the one thing most fear the most, their own reflection. Dr. Ingrid Solberg, a forensic psychologist at Halden, described it this way. Isolation destroys the mind from the outside. Guilt destroys it from the inside. Our job is to bring the inmate to the edge of that guilt and teach them how to survive it without running back to denial. That's the paradox of the perfect prison. It's not built to punish the body. It's built to confront the soul. For some, that confrontation becomes freedom. For others, it becomes unbearable. Take the story of Jonas, a 34-year-old former gang enforcer from Oslo. Jonas was serving 15 years for armed robbery and attempted murder. At first, he laughed at Halden's comfort. He mocked the guards, ignored therapy, refused to cook, refused to speak. He said, "You can't fix what's already broken." But months passed. The silence began to work on him. Not the silence of isolation, but the silence of absence. No screaming, no violence, no chaos to blame. Only his thoughts, quiet, heavy, relentless. He told Dr. Solberg one day, "You made prison too soft. Now I can finally hear the noise inside my head." And that was the point. In Halden, the walls don't crush you. They reflect you. Jonas broke down in his 7th month. He started attending psychology sessions voluntarily. He learned about emotional regulation, accountability, and cognitive reframing, techniques that, in his words, felt like learning to walk without fists. By year 3, he was mentoring younger inmates. By year 5, he was released and never returned. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not every story ends like Jonas's, because empathy, too, can be a mirror. And some people, when shown compassion, don't see redemption. They see weakness. Halden's guards admit this. We can't save everyone, Henrik says. Some men mistake kindness for permission. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, when the mind learns to justify harm so deeply that empathy no longer reaches it. For those prisoners, even paradise becomes prison. Dr. Solberg explains. We give them every tool to rebuild, but they still have to pick it up themselves. And yet, in global studies, Norway has one of the lowest reoffending rates in the world, barely 20%. Compare that to the US, where it's nearly 70%. So maybe Halden's comfort isn't weakness. Maybe it's confrontation by another name. Because when the noise stops, when the violence fades, when there's no one left to blame but yourself, That's when the real sentence begins. That's the hidden cruelty of the perfect prison. You can walk the halls freely, but there's nowhere to hide from what you've done. But what about those who never find peace? Not in the chaos, not in the kindness? Psychologists have a term for it: institutionalization. It's what happens when the mind becomes addicted to captivity. When the routine, the predictability, the control becomes safer than freedom itself. For many long-term inmates, the idea of leaving is more terrifying than staying. One American psychologist calls it psychological amputation. Because freedom, once cut off, doesn't grow back easily. When released, many former inmates describe feeling invisible. The world moves too fast. The air feels too wide. Simple choices, like buying food, taking the bus, even crossing the street, trigger anxiety, confusion, or panic. That's not weakness. That's adaptation. The brain rewired itself to survive in captivity, and now struggles to survive without it. Some return to prison voluntarily. Others sabotage themselves unconsciously. Because behind every reoffender, there's not just crime. There's craving. Craving for the structure that once kept the chaos out. In interviews, one former inmate described it perfectly. In there, I knew the rules. Out here, everything's too open. It's like being dropped into a maze without walls. Psychologists say this is the cruel irony of incarceration. It teaches obedience, not independence. Compliance, not confidence. So when the gates open, freedom feels less like release and more like drowning. That's why the final stage of prison psychology isn't inside the walls. It's what happens after you leave them. Freedom. A word that sounds simple, but feels heavier than chains. When a man or woman steps out of prison, they don't walk into the same world they left. They walk into one that's already judged them. No job, no home, no trust. The sentence continues, invisible this time. Psychologists working with reentry programs say reintegration is the most critical and most ignored phase of the incarceration cycle. Because what good is reform if society refuses to believe in it? Dr. Samuel Green, an American criminologist, once said, "We build prisons to protect society, but we forget that one day almost everyone inside those prisons will return to it." Rehabilitation isn't about erasing the past. It's about redefining identity. And that begins with belonging. In programs across the U.S., Norway, and even Thailand, former inmates who rebuild their lives share one psychological trait: purpose. Purpose rewires guilt into growth. It gives pain a destination. Like Marcus Reed, a man who turned his prison experience into a global mentorship movement. Or the ex-gang leader in Brazil, who now runs literacy programs for street kids. Or the Women's Collective in the Philippines, teaching prisoners how to sew and sell online. Each story begins the same. A mind once caged, learning to fly again. Because psychology isn't just about understanding what breaks a person. It's about discovering what still holds them together. Freedom, at its core, isn't physical. It's mental. And when a man learns to master his thoughts, his emotions, his choices, no wall, no chain, no sentence can define him. The mind is the real prison, but it's also the only key.